will be a better format. So I actually pitched him the idea of making a graphic novel, and he said that'd be cool as he was signing my book, and I'm like, oh. So that kind of kicked us off and running. And so I was trying to figure out, what I want to tell or how I want to tell the story. This is a big influence for me. This is Torso by Brian Michael Bendis, and I read this book in 2000, so about 12 years ago. And this was like no comic book I'd ever seen before. How many people here actually read comic books? A few of you. So this is very different from the Marvel and DC stuff I grew up with. This is a historically accurate book. It takes place in the during Prohibition. It's all black and white with like these massive two-page spreads, and it had just a phenomenal use of sort of darn black space on the page. And they actually would take newspaper clippings and like Xerox copy them right into the text. And it was just a really cool way, I thought, to tell history and to tell a story, where they could be very generous with how they laid out their panels and didn't have to really worry about running out of space. So it's just it sort of opened my eyes as to what the format could be. And this is an example where the panels like run sideways, you have to like rotate the book, and then there's sort of this like descent into madness spirals. You have to like So if you think about what I did with the iPad and how you really want to rotate and use that thing, and how it doesn't really have any limits to how much content it can show because it's not physically printed. This book was a tremendous influence, and I think you can really see that in the work that I've done, which you'll see shortly. So essentially what this means is that we created two products, a 210-page historically accurate graphic novel in print format, and an interactive iPad experience. And as artists, we're going to need assets that would satisfy both of these products. So what that means is, as a video game person, I had to learn the rules of comics, which was hard to do at first. Comics has this whole, whole paradigm of storytelling and format and structure. And coming in as someone from games who works, with a different mentality, and my writer who comes from animated film, it was definitely a steep learning curve for us. One of the biggest differences, if you think about the difference between making these two formats, is that, on the top left corner here, we have the team that made the latest Deus Ex game. I'm trying to remember what it's called, but basically, you have a team of 80 people making a single product. Your mentality as an artist is very different than, say, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, who made Watchmen, right? They got much more ownership and much more authorship over what they're doing. And it's much more labor intensive in certain ways as well, because you are controlling the entire experience when you're making a comic book, versus being a team member that works with lots of other people on a game or on an animated film. And so what this also meant is that comics at their heart are artisanal. I think the mentality going in as a creator in that space is much more about art and much more about ownership, and I don't think you get nearly as attached when you're working on a video game. I think you can still have a healthy level of attachment, but you also recognize that it isn't your vision necessarily, it's the team's vision or the art director's vision. But at their heart, I'd say the comics are an artisanal artwork, or artisanal work. So the basic rules of comics. So in American comics, we go left to right, top to bottom, 6 panels on the page average, and when to use insets and when to use splash panels all become part of the visual language. But the most important part of it is pacing the story on the page turn. Because comics are part of printed books, you are built in with this limitation of having to constantly turn the page. And so there's actually a pacing that takes place as a storyteller, where that page break and that page turn become a critical part of how you pace the narrative. So this is these are 4 pages from Ajax, who's shown as inks, and because the great author to start at ending points, which is pretty obvious for anyone who reads comics, and so you can kind of see how there's a cliffhanger at the end of every page, right? So we start with this sort of like group of insets that introduces this larger airport scene where this American diplomat's getting off an airplane, and we don't really know what's going to happen, and then we cut, at the end of that to a reverse shot of him inside the airplane about to step out of the plane, and then all hell breaks loose, and all these angry protesting Iranians, like, trying to storm the whole scene, and he has to be like thrown into this car at the very end, and you're like, oh, what's going to happen, right? And then we cut to the next page of him looking out the window of all the protesters pressing against the window, and he drives off with this forlorn look on his face, and President Truman starts getting the note of this. And so it's this pattern of like, what next, what next, what next? If you want to see what this looks like when it comes to where your eyes kind of go and how they travel across the page, the red circles are the points of focus, and the green arrows are how they travel. So you can kind of see it zigzagging down the page, and left to right, top to bottom across all these. So it sort of shows you as an artist or as a writer thinking about how you compose a rhythm to this format. The other consideration is that comics on mobile, breaking the page for the screen. We were making a comic for a mobile device. What happened is we started off making a print format book, and then the iPad came along, and so we broke all of our pieces all of our pages into layers so we could put it there. But you hit a pretty big problem early on, and if you look at the comics page on the left, the phone screen's not very big. And if you contrast that to, say, a book, which is text-based, you can reflow text in almost infinite ways, and it reads the same every time. the page break isn't really a factor when it comes to how you read a story. But in comics, it's critical. And so you're kind of left with this like, well, how do I deal with this sort of like, frame by frame or panel by panel approach to the film? And so Comixology and Marvel has done sort of an interesting approach to that. I'll show you their reader here. This is sort of their way of dealing with that. So you have full page, and then if you double tap one of the panels, which will happen shortly here, it kind of zooms in and gives you this sort of like isolated animated crop bar view. So it's still a PDF, it's just how you sort of present it to make it work. And so by being able to rotate and crop and sort of present your content dynamically, it's sort of the best of both worlds approach, taking something that's normally in print format and making it read on a mobile device. So essentially what this means is it comes down to presentation. How do you want to actually present this content? So we wanted to go further than that. We wanted to add motion and sound and interactivity and all this sort of stuff. And so you could really retell my entire presentation how to add motion and sound to comics without making them suck. But essentially, there's sort of some basic rules we wanted to establish early on so that we didn't break the experience of a comic book. So we wanted to honor the reading experience. This meant no spoken dialogue, advance the story at your own pace. It's not a film experience. And unfortunately, when people think of motion comics, you think of, it's people who work in film or are given comics assets and are trying to, recontextualize that in their frame, which is typically filmmaking. So I'm going to show you an example. I apologize in advance for how terrible. Well, just to go back a second, though, to talk about the idea of adding motion to a format and trying to maintain the essence without breaking it. How many people here know what cinemagraphs are? Anyone heard of cinemagraph before? A handful of you. Okay, so photography's gone entirely digital now for the most part, right? It used to be something that would take place in the physical world, you'd scan it in, and then you'd have like a digital version of it. That was like a big deal, right? Like back in the day, like if anyone ever tried to like internet date when they were like, in the 90s when you're on dial-up and you have no idea how to like give someone a photograph over the internet. But now, like we're in the Instagram age and everyone's like, has a digital camera on their phone, and photos are taken and born and shared digitally, and it's like a big deal to print it out and frame it, put it on the wall, right? So now that we have DSLRs, which are basically creating video and photos, there's a way to combine that stuff together. And there's this new format emerging called a cinemagraph. Essentially what it is taking a high-resolution image and taking high-resolution video and then looping some video back into it because it's going to be a digital product that's displayed on a screen. Unfortunately, if you don't do it right, it really kind of sucks. And this is an example of one that's really bad. So you can see there's this like endless like looping of taxis, which I think is really distracting. And there's like frozen people next to them. It doesn't really make sense. And I think in a way this is really destroying the essence of the photograph because it's not really ignorable. You don't really take in the whole composition of this. And it's losing the essence of what a photograph is. So let me offer you Exhibit B. There's a pretty profound difference between those two. It's the same idea, right? A taxi going by in a cityscape. But the tools of motion are being applied with far more artistic merit here. The things that are still make sense staying still. The things that are moving make sense moving. And the things that are moving are relatively ignorable. You can change the timing of that and have it go by once an hour, or once every 45 seconds. But there's a way to adjust it. And I think that just like with anything else in photography, whether it be composition or lighting or color or all soft focus, motion is now a tool as well to be played with. And it's just a matter of how do we as creators and artists figure out how to apply this. And so I wanted to use the same mentality going into comics. How do we apply motion and sound? All these things don't exist in a printed book, but do it in a way that actually improves the format instead of making it look gimmicky and hokey and terrible. So speaking of gimmicky and hokey and terrible, this is what people typically see when they think of motion comics.
Violence of any kind will never be tolerated.
Yes. Sorry, enough of that. That's what most motion comics are. It's like, people trying to like make movies with not enough resources, and they take these like drawings and try to animate them. It's not comics. And I think that a lot of people in the industry really hate the term motion comics because when they think of that, they think of that, and it's not really a good way to apply that stuff. So we want to add motion and sound while respecting the rules of comics. I didn't ask you if it's possible to actually project from Ajax. I have a VGA connector for it. Is it possible to actually connect it? Because I can pull up a video if not, but it's much cooler if I can.
Should be able to. Have we got the right connector?
Yeah, let me grab the device. So I'm going to show you guys a little bit of Ajax now. I can show you our.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
it's a big deal. I can also just show a video of it.